Díomh agus fáilte rash to the Crazy House Prices podcast, the podcast where I help you buy your own home, understand the madness of the Irish housing market and generally just adult a bit better. I'm your host Ciarán Mulqueen and this week is a bit of a mixed bag. It's mostly bad obviously because this is housing in Ireland and we are not allowed nice things, but there are one or two small bits of good news buried in the rubble, so I will try and finish on those where I can. We're going to talk about a new report showing that in some counties there are more than 25 times as many Airbnbs as homes available to rent. We're going to talk about housing starts collapsing last year, which is a massive warning sign for what's coming down the tracks, and that's something I've spoken about in previous episodes. And we're going to talk about the chief executive of Glenveagh basically saying the government now has the right policy mix in place, which is interesting timing when housing starts have just fallen off a cliff. We're also going to look at the fact that nearly 60 ghost estates still remain in Ireland almost 20 years after the crash, which honestly is such a perfectly Irish sentence. Then I want to get into what is probably the main good news story this week, which is that planning rules for normal home renovations could finally be changed up in a way that might actually make life a little bit easier for ordinary people. I'll also touch a little bit on mortgage rates because there's now a growing risk that the ECB could move sooner than expected, and if you're on a variable rate or coming off a fixed rate like me, that really matters. And then I want to zoom out for a minute and look at what's happening at EU level and also over in the States. And I loathe to talk about America at the moment, but we have to anyway. So whatever your politics are, it's interesting to see what other places are trying to at least kind of grapple with housing as a political emergency. So there's a lot to get through. So let's get into it. Let's start with a story that really gets to the heart of why so many renters in Ireland feel like they're going absolutely mad. So Threshold has come out with a new analysis saying that there are now at least 4 times as many Airbnbs as full-time private rental properties available nationwide. The figures they gave were about 8,600 short-term lets versus around 2,100 long-term rental homes. And they say even that is conservative because they don't include hosts with only one listing, as that might be the family home being rented out occasionally for a month or two here or there, which is fair enough. So if you include those one listing properties as well, the number of short-term lets jumps to just over 20,000. So that's nearly 10 times the number of private rentals available. So just think about that for a second. We're constantly told the rental market is tight because we need to build more. And yes, we obviously do need to build more. But this report is saying that a huge part of the problem is that homes that could house people are instead being used for tourists, for weekend breaks, hen parties, golf trips and whatever else. And when you break it down county by county, it gets even more extreme. So Kerry has 1,009 short-term rentals and just 33 homes advertised for rent. That's a ratio of 31 to 1. Clare is 28 to 1. Donegal is 24 to 1. Mayo is 14 to 1. And Leitrim is 12 to 1. Even in Cork City and County, where you might expect a bit more balance because of the size of the place, there are 3.7 Airbnbs for every one home available to rent. So when people say, why can't I find anywhere to rent, or why is every viewing like people trying to kill each other over getting a home? Well, this is one big part of it. I've kind of been speaking about Airbnb for years now. I don't think it's the biggest problem, but it is a big problem. We've allowed a huge amount of housing stock to just go into the short-term market while we just kind of pretend that it's just some unavoidable act and this is what we have to put up with. So Threshold is also very critical of the government changing its approach on small towns, and the idea was to restrict short-term lets in towns over 10,000 population, but that threshold was then, pardon the pun, was then raised to 20,000. So their point is that this weakens the policy and leaves loads of smaller towns exposed. And this is where the story matters far beyond just renters, because a lot of renters want to buy. They're not renters by choice. So they're renters because they can't get their own home. They can't buy their own home. So if homes are being diverted away from long-term rental, those people then can't save properly, they can't settle, and they can't move along the housing chain. So this is one of those stories that just drives me mad all the time. It comes out a few times a year, and it just goes like it just shows you how ridiculous it all is. Supply, it's not just about like the amount of cranes you see around. It's about what we do with the homes that already exist. Supply doesn't just mean new things. Now, to be fair, obviously tourism does matter, and in some counties it does matter a lot. So I'm not pretending every Airbnb is evil or that every short-term let should disappear tomorrow. But when you have counties where there are literally 20 or 30 times more short-term lets than long-term rentals, then you don't have a healthy balance anymore. You have housing policy that has just completely lost the run of itself. And this is where I think the government has been far too timid in this. I think if a home is functioning as a de facto hotel room this is in the middle of a housing emergency, then the state should be willing to step in much harder than it currently does. Because here's the thing, the person that's missing out it's not just a number on a sheet. This is like a young teacher, a nurse, a guard, a couple with a baby, the person who grew up in that town that now cannot afford to stay there. So if you're a renter and you feel like there's nothing out there, you're not imagining it. And if you're living in a tourist heavy county, this report backs up what people have been saying for years. Now, staying on supply and on the mismatch between what we're told and what is actually happening, let's move to the new housing starts, because this is another big warning sign. Again, I've spoken about this in previous episodes. So the latest housing market monitor from Banking and Payments Federation Ireland says that housing commencements fell by more than 3/4 last year. So there were just over 16,000 housing commencements in 2025, which is down from over 69,000 in 2024. Now, straight away, one thing to say here is that in 2024, they had a big rush of activity before the development levy waiver expired. So that inflated the comparison a bit, which is important. But even taking that into account, the drop is still incredibly sharp. And in some of the most important local authority areas in the country, it's even worse. So Fingal and South Dublin both saw activity fall by almost 84%. And Dublin City also saw a sharp decline. And this, again, matters because they're key growth areas. These are the places where huge numbers of people need homes. And the BPFI chief economist, Ali Ugar, I don't know if I'm saying his name properly, basically said what this means is that there is now a real risk to future supply beyond this year unless there's significant rebound in apartment and scheme commencements in 2026, which I don't agree with either. But in plain English, what gets started now becomes what gets delivered later. So if starts collapse, then that feeds into lower output down the line. So it's especially in 2027 and 2028. So there were about 5,900 units started in the final quarter of 2025, which is down 65.5% year on year. Now, there was one more positive side to this. So completions were strong. So there were 36,284 homes completed in 2025, which was up 20.4% on the year before, and the highest annual total since the year end in June 2009. And in the final quarter alone, almost 12,000 homes were completed, which is up 38.5%. And apartment completions were especially strong, up over 46% to more than 9,600 units. There was also a rise in residential planning permissions in the third quarter of last year, up 29.4% to just over 11,100 units, the highest since the second quarter of 2023. So it's not all bad. There is momentum in completions, but the problem is what is coming down the line in 2027 and 2028. Because if you have 1 year where you're basically like feasting on the projects that have already been done, while the next layer then starts is really weak, you end up with a really nasty gap then, and that's what we're going to see. So my take on this is it's a bit classic Ireland. Like, we finally get decent completion numbers, and then immediately there's a massive question mark over what happens next. So the completions figures are good, and so I should say that. But if 36,284 homes are actually completed in a year, that's better than where we have been. But really, that should be 86,280. Well, really, it should be 100,000 homes. And I always come back to the same question: who are these completed for? Because we already know from other recent data in our major cities, a lot of new supply is not ending up in the hands of ordinary buyers. So when I hear these kind of completion numbers, I'm not automatically getting excited about it, because I want to know who can actually buy them, who can rent them or live in them. And the start figure is a big concern, because housing policy in Ireland is so reactive. So if you're house hunting right now, the completions numbers are a slight positive. But if you're looking ahead in 2027 and beyond, supply is just going to tighten really restricted unless something insane happens, which I can't see happening. And speaking of people claiming the policy mix is now right, the next story landed at almost the exact same time, which I have to say is fairly cheeky timing. And this is Glenveagh Homes. So Glenveagh says the policy mix is right. So Stephen Garvey is the chief executive of Glenveagh Homes. He says the government now has the right policy mix in place to deliver 50,000 homes a year. Again, I would argue we need double that. But anyway, he said that changes announced last year, things like design standard changes, the overhaul of rent rules, and a reduction in VAT on new builds have removed an estimated €100,000 viability gap for apartments. And I guess that's an important number because when developers and investors talk about viability, what they really mean is whether the sums add up well enough for them to make enough profit. So Garvey also said the feedback he got from investors at MIPIM in Cannes, which you might have seen doing, I spoke about it last week and you might see it do the rounds in the news, was that Ireland has made the big decisions early and that there is now momentum here. He even said Ireland is now being looked at as potentially having addressed these big issues. Now, Glenveagh's own numbers were really strong. Revenue was up to 926 million. Operating profit rose to 144.1 million. And the company delivered 2,568 homes last year, which was up 11%, though still below their forecasts. And Garvey says their land bank should allow them to build about 3,600 units by 2028. So they're pretty small numbers, but what I will say personally about Glenveagh is I think a lot of the homes they build are actually for sale. So I think that's what we need more of, more like Glenveagh, who are actually building to sell and not build to rent. But anyway, the average selling price last year was about €347,000, which is down from €365,000, though they say that's mainly because of site and product mix, whatever that means. And they expect that to go back over 375,000 in 2026 before settling nearer 350,000 on a more normalised basis, excluding future house price inflation. Again, whatever that means. He's also pushing off-site manufacturing, which I think is good, and industrialised construction as a key part of increasing supply, and says Glenveagh is partly insulated from future cost inflation because it has its own timber frame operation and a lot of its costs for the next couple of years are already procured. Now, look, none of that's surprising from the CEO of a major home builder. He's hardly going to come out and say this is all a disaster, is it? Or he's not going to criticise government either because the Help to Buy and all of that is, all the housing policy is very, very developer friendly. So he's obviously not going to be criticising it. But what is interesting is the contrast between this and the starts data. So on one hand, the chief executive of one of the country's biggest builders is saying the policy mix is right. And on the other hand, the actual commencements have fallen off a cliff. So which is it? So there are two ways to read this story. The first is the optimistic reading, which is that policy changes have genuinely started to make apartments more viable and investor confidence is improving and all of that. Or the more cynical reading could be that the policies are improving profit. So they say viability, that means profit for developers and investors, but that doesn't automatically mean that they're improving affordability or access for you and me. And that's my issue with it. So I've no problems with developers making a profit. Obviously, we need private builders, we need scale, we need speed, we need apartments to stack up financially. That's all fine. But if the right policy mix basically means making Ireland more attractive to institutional investors while first-time buyers still can't get near any large chunks of supply, then I don't think that's a good thing. And that is the question I would put back to government then, and Glenveagh, would be if 50,000 homes a year are being built, who are they for? Are they for owner occupiers? Are they cost rental? Are they social housing? Are they built to rent funds? Because they're not all the same thing. So that's where a lot of anger comes from me, from other people. People aren't stupid. They can see construction activity and then they still feel completely locked out because the home that's just being built beside them is not available to buy. So any policy that improves viability, I think, is worth watching, but don't confuse viability or profit for the sector with affordability for you. They're related, but they're not the same thing. Now, on the subject of homes that already exist and could be used better, let's talk about one of the most frustratingly Irish stories of all time, which is ghost estates. And we are somehow still here. So there are nearly 60 ghost estates still in Ireland. So RTE this week went to all 31 local authorities asking how many ghost estates officially called unfinished housing developments still remain on their books. And of the 27 that responded, there were 58 ghost estates reported. So Donegal had the highest number with 12, so that's probably down to the mica and pyrite thing. Tipperary had 10 and Leitrim had 7. 12 local authorities said they no longer have any ghost estates at all. Now, to be fair, there has been progress. So in 2021, the number was 123, and in 2023, it was 75, and now it is at least 58. So that is movement in the right direction, but still nearly 20 years on from the crash, the fact that we even have any ghost estates, I think, is mad. These estates are basically relics of the crash that still have real people living in them or living beside them, dealing with the consequences of it. And the RT report gave the example of Glen Court in Emly, County Tipperary, where Gillian Moore was moved there back in 2007. And the estate was only officially taken charge by the council last year after 18 years as a ghost estate. So that means for years, residents were just in limbo. The council was not responsible for maintaining things because it had not taken in charge, and Glen Court did not have kind of working street lights until 2018. So imagine that, like 11 years living there in the darkness. And they also had severe sewage problems with raw sewage coming up through the manholes and drains. Residents applied to have the estate taken charge in 2013, and it took until 2025 for that to finally happen. And there are still derelict houses there that have never been occupied. Some have been burnt out, windows smashed, roofs caved in. The residents in local tidy towns, volunteers have been maintaining the front gardens just to stop the place looking even worse. Another example was Kilnamana Manor in Dundrum, Tipperary, not Dublin, where some houses were built, more were meant to follow, and then the whole thing just stalled, leaving a strange half-finished development years later. So this story matters because ghost estates are not just like old symbols of the crash, but they're also potential homes in the worst housing emergency the state has ever seen. So even if some of them need work or some need like legal and infrastructure issues solved, they represent wasted housing stock in a country absolutely desperate for homes. So I actually think this is one of the most under-discussed housing stories in the country, because when we talk about supply, again, we usually jump straight to building new homes. And yeah, of course, like we need new homes, but we also need to ask why it takes so unbelievably long to sort out developments that already exist. So how on earth does taking in charge process drag on for over a decade? Like, how do people pay property tax and still end up living with no lights and sewage coming up out of the ground? Because technically the estate is not fully the council's problem yet. So I just don't think it's good enough. Now, the slight good news here is that the number is falling. So 123 down to 58, that's really good. And that's something to celebrate, I think, but the pace is just really, really slow. And in a housing crisis, every one of those sites, I think, should be treated like a little mini emergency project, because the frustrating thing is some of these homes are very fixable. So in the report, like, they're not like castles like in the middle of nowhere that are going to cost an absolute bomb. They're just houses in estates where like they have services, they have amenities. Like it's easy enough there, I would imagine, to fix a lot of them. So it's one of those stories that's just worth remembering when people say there's nothing the state can do quickly. There are existing homes and half-finished developments around the country that should be getting much more urgent attention. You're probably overpaying for your mortgage protection. Now, I'm not, because I use Beat the Bank and I've been dealing with them for years. They're an Irish company, and in a world where most companies in the home buying process are out for themselves, it's refreshing to have one that genuinely cares about you. As cliche as that sounds, but they really do. So how they work is they check the main insurers, they match the best price, and then they take more off. It's quick, it's online, and they handle all the paperwork. They also do income protection, life insurance, and soon they'll be doing home insurance, car insurance, even pet insurance. So www.beatthebank.ie to get a quote in seconds. Now, that's all quite grim, but the next one is the first bit of good news I found this week. Cautious good news, I would say, but look, I'll take what I can get. So, planning rules for home renovations could finally be loosened. So, this one caught my eye because it's practical, it affects real people, and could actually make life easier. So, a big review of domestic planning exemptions is due to be published in the coming weeks. And according to reports, it could include a fairly sweeping list of changes. So, among the proposals are bigger extensions without planner permission, so going from 40 square meters up to 45. Dormer extensions and attic conversions could become exempt. Velux windows at the front of houses could become exempt. External wall insulation could be exempt. Bike storage and bin storage in front gardens could be exempt. Modular or cabin style homes up to 45 square meters at the rear of existing houses could potentially be built without planning permission. And perhaps most significantly, homes could be allowed to be subdivided into two separate living spaces with the aim of helping older people downsize or helping adult children who cannot move out because the market is so dysfunctional. Planning Minister John Cummings says he wants to cut the red tape and remove items from the planning process that do not need to be there. And Housing Minister James Brown says the aim is to free up planners so they can focus on actual housing and infrastructure delivery instead of getting caught up in neighbourhood rows and legal disputes over a Velux window. And to be fair, I think there is logic to that. And the current rules were last reviewed in 2001, which is mad in itself, like 25 years later. So the world's obviously completely changed since then. Housing needs have changed, family structures have changed, construction methods have changed. Even the fact the minister mentioned bike sheds should tell you how outdated the system is. Now, there are cautions too. So Dermot Bannon, one of my favourite TV personalities, criticised the modular homes idea and said that if that's how we're tackling the housing crisis, then we have failed. And the Society of Chartered Surveyors urged caution about subdividing homes, warning about poor quality conversions and the risk of a sort of shadow economy of unregulated works by unqualified builders. And that's all a fair concern as well. And nobody wants a kind of a free-for-all where every semi-D gets chopped up into awful little units by cowboys. But overall, there's something sensible here. And if you can safely create extra living space or a small separate unit or a better retrofit without dragging people through months and months of planning bureaucracy, then that seems like common sense to me. That is probably the clearest good news story of the week for me, not because it solves a housing crisis. It doesn't, like, let's not get carried away. A bike shed in your front garden is not exactly a housing for all masterstroke, but because this is a kind of practical reform that can actually make a difference around the edges and make a difference in people, normal people's lives. And in housing, those little small wins, I think they really matter. And a lot of people have parents getting older. A lot of people have kind of adult kids stuck at home and they want to do a retrofit. A lot of people want to convert an attic or build a slightly bigger extension. So all of this, I think, could be a good thing in those cases. So yeah, bring in sensible exemptions, but do it properly. Put clear standards around them. Make sure subdivision means one extra decent unit, not turning homes into dangerous kind of rabbit hutches. And make sure modular homes are safe, serviced, and not being used as a sneaky excuse for the state to dodge the kind of bigger supply problem. Still, overall, I think this is a move in the right direction. So if you want to own a home, have parents with space, or are thinking about a renovation or a small separate unit, keep an eye on this. It could open up real options for families in the next while. Now, from one story that might help some households in practical ways, let's move to a story that could hurt them financially if things go the wrong way, and that is mortgage rates. So the ECB rate rise risk and what it means for Irish borrowers. Now, there is now a growing risk that the European Central Bank could raise interest rates sooner and by more than people were expecting. This is according to comments from Peter Casimir. Again, I'm not sure I'm pronouncing his name right, but he sits on the ECB Governing Council. He said there is no need to act at next week's meeting and that the ECB is still in a good place for now. But he also said upside risks clearly dominate the outlook and that a reaction by the ECB may be closer than many people think. So markets are now pricing in the possibility of a quarter point hike by September and roughly another 0.7 percentage points by the year end. That's a serious change in mood compared to where things were before. And the big concern is the conflict in the Middle East could lead to higher energy prices and broader inflation pressures, which in turn could force the ECB to make the move. Now, the good news, relatively speaking, is that Irish mortgage rates in January were fairly static. The average rate was 3.5%, which was unchanged on December and down from 3.82% a year earlier. And that's the lowest level since February 2023. Still, Irish rates remain the seventh highest highest in the now 21 member Eurozone, compared with a Eurozone average of 3.39%. So we're still paying more than plenty of our neighbours. And Dara Cassidy from bonkers.ie made the obvious but important point: if you're on a fixed rate, you're protected for now, and nothing changes until your fixed term ends. And if you're on a variable rate or coming off fixed rate in the next while, like I am, then it's something that you need to watch closely. And I think a lot of people are probably just exhausted by this stage. Just when people start to feel maybe there could be a bit of breathing room, suddenly there's talk of rates going back up again. So this is one of those stories where I don't want to be alarmist, because rates are not rising tomorrow morning and nobody should be panicking. But it's a good reminder that the housing market doesn't operate in a vacuum, and we're such a tiny country. Like any other bit large companies or large countries' cough tends to be our cold. So global events can feed through into your monthly repayments very quickly. And I also think it shows how exposed we are. So Irish housing is so expensive, and deposits are so hard to build, and repayments are already so high relative to incomes that even a relatively modest shift in rates can really hurt. So it's why I always say, when people are calculating what they can borrow, don't just ask, can I technically get approved for this? Ask yourself, could I still live okay if rates moved against me, or if childcare went up, or your car died, or whatever life throws at you. Now, I've loads of podcasts done on kind of personal finances and stuff like that, but if you're on a variable rate, just review your options. And if you, like me, you're due off a fixed rate in the next while, start paying attention now rather than waiting for that letter in the post. I would say talk to a broker 6 months in advance. And if you're buying, build in a bit of breathing room if you can. I always say try and just allow yourself for a 1% increase. To zoom out for a second, because housing's not just a mess in Ireland, it's a kind of wider mess globally. And the next story is interesting because for the first time the EU has voted through a housing plan at block level. So the EU finally has a housing plan, but not everyone is impressed, is the headline. So for the first time ever, the European Parliament has passed a plan dedicated entirely to housing, and the measures include trying to increase funding for local councils so that they can build housing, trying to discourage the rise of short-term lets in tourist hotspots, simplifying planning processes to speed up development, and improving access to finance for housing development, especially for smaller developers, including through the European Investment Bank. Now, on the face of it, some of that sounds very good, very sensible. More money for local authorities to build is good. Trying to curb short-term lets, that's good. Simplifying planning where it's excessive, that's good. And it's important politically because it treats housing as a European issue, not just something each country has to sort on its own. Aidan O'Riordan described it as a breakthrough and said housing affordability, tenant protection and homelessness are European challenges, but support is not unanimous. So the left group in the parliament blasted the plan as a kind of a love letter to the construction industry. Sinn Féin, Kathleen Funchion, I'm not sure I'm saying her name properly, and Lynn Boylan, they were among critics as well. Their argument is basically that the plans lean too heavily towards cutting regulation, lowering barriers for developers and backing private sector solutions, while not going nearly hard enough on financialisation, speculation, eviction protections and the EU fiscal rules that can limit public housing investment. So I can kind of see both sides of it. If the EU's contribution to housing is mostly to make it easier for developers and investors, then people are entitled to be sceptical because we've been hearing versions of that for years. But equally, if the EU can help loosen some of the rules around state aid and funding and investment for public housing, or help local authorities borrow and build more, then that could actually be good. So I think this is kind of symbolically important, but I wouldn't be getting, overly excited just yet. Housing becoming an EU level issue is a big deal, shows that it's widespread and people across Europe are being hammered the same as we are. So politically, yeah, I think it does matter that the EU is no longer pretending it's someone else's problem. But the proof will be in the pudding, as they say. And if it's just more kind of words about things, let's just see what actually happens. So what I would say is just don't ignore EU housing policy. It sounds kind of distant and a bit boring, I know, but a lot of the funding rules and state aid rules that shape what governments can do actually sit at that level. And speaking of other countries at least trying things, the US had a housing story this week that loads of people actually sent to me because, look, whatever you say about America, they do sometimes manage to say the quiet part out loud. So the US Senate passes a housing bill and there is one part Ireland should notice. So the US Senate has passed a broad bipartisan housing bill aimed at improving access and affordability. So it passed 89-10, which in modern politics is basically unheard of. And the bill includes reducing introducing some regulations, expanding how housing dollars can be used to build affordable homes and rentals, and giving local governments more tools, allowing banks to invest more in affordable housing, and making it easier to use private finance to rehabilitate public housing. It also tries to make home building easier by streamlining certain environmental reviews and inspections, and it includes changes around modular and manufactured housing to make that cheaper and easier to deliver. Now, there's one especially interesting part. The bill would bar institutional investors from buying single family homes once they own 350 or more, which is insane, but they'd still be allowed to buy or build homes for rental, but they'd have to sell them to an individual home buyer after 7 years. Now, critics say the threshold is too high, the impact may be limited, and it could even reduce rental supply in some places, which is fair enough. And politically, it may still get bogged down. The House may not just accept the Senate version, and Trump's kind of wider political demands could slow things down, and there could be a conference process that drags on for months. So it's not in law yet, and to be honest, I don't think Trump's cronies will allow it to happen. But still, the fact that there is some sort of like legislation saying maybe huge corporate investors should not be hoovering up family homes, I think that's good, and that's what caught my eye. So because in Ireland, we spent years acting like it's some sort of mad fringe opinion to say maybe it's not a good idea that investment funds are getting privileged access to housing stock, while people like you and I would be homeowners are left bidding on the scraps. So I'm not saying copy and paste American housing policy, absolutely not. They have their own set of problems, but I do think this is politically interesting because it shows that even in America, where the private market is basically a religion, there's now mainstream support for the idea that corporate ownership of homes can distort the market, and that's a conversation we've needed much more honestly about in Ireland. So again, I'm not anti-rental, I'm not anti-investment, full stop. We need rental supply, we need capital, we need development, but there also has to be a line somewhere where policymakers say, look, family homes should be prioritised for family. And too often in Ireland, that line just kind of disappears the minute someone mentions viability, or as I say, profit or institutional capital. So sometimes it's useful to look abroad, not because they've all the answers, but because it helps expose how narrow our own policy debate can be here. Agus Sinné Lahai on episode shut of the Crazy House Prices podcast. So we have Airbnbs swallowing up housing stock, starts are collapsing, developers saying the policy mix is right, ghost estates, all of that kind of stuff. So where does that leave us this week? So I think there are two kind of big themes running through all of these stories. The first is that housing supply is about much more than just kind of headline numbers. It's not about 36,000 homes completed. You also have to ask where they are, who they're for, who can afford them, how many are actually available to buy, how many existing homes are being lost to short-term lets, how many unfinished homes are sitting idle, how many vacant and derelict homes are there, and whether the homes being planned now will actually turn into supply later. And then the second is that a lot of the crisis is a political choice. So we choose what gets prioritised. We choose whether homes are treated mainly as places to live or as financial assets. We choose whether planning rules are sensible or ridiculous. So just in terms of good news, because I said I would try and find some, I think there are two small positives. So one is the planning exemptions that if they're done properly, I think could be good. And two, if the number of ghost estates keep coming down, I think that would be great. So if you found this useful or this episode useful, please do share it with someone. If you want to support what I do and get access to bonus Q&As, you can join my Patreon. It's just €3 a month. First week is free, and it genuinely helps keep the podcast going and helps me keep putting stuff together on Instagram as well. And of course, my book, How to Buy a Home in Ireland, is available nationwide, or you can borrow it at your local library for free. So please do make sure you're subscribed to the podcast so you don't miss future episodes. And thank you for listening. Slán go fóill.